right, and see my screen, correct?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So thanks everyone for joining the Alpha Data developer group here. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Mohit Srivastava. I've been, working in the Salesforce ecosystem for almost now 10 years. Previously, we, worked with SI partners, and then I was working with a PDO, helping build App Exchange applications on Salesforce. And last 4 months, I joined Salesforce as a lead developer evangelist because I like so much working with the community here, our Ohana community. And you can follow me on my Twitter handle, and I'm always responsive there. So if you have any questions or feedback or comments or anything, in general related to Salesforce development, do get in touch with me. Sometimes I might have answers, sometimes I might not, but if I don't have, I'll try to get in touch with someone inside Salesforce and get you the answers. All right, let's move on. So yeah, so because I'm a Salesforce employee, forward-looking statement, which generally means that today in this demo, I'll showcase some functionalities and I'll use some products that are forward-looking. But please do not make any purchasing decision based on them. They are forward-looking. In fact, the functions, the Salesforce functions that I'll talk about today, is still in the active development phase. So there will be changes to the CLI, there will be changes to the commands, there will be changes to the API. So there's so many things that that's in flight. So I request that do not make any purchasing decision, but use this as a purely learning opportunity and use it when the product is GA, because then you'll get excellent support. Okay. All right. So first of all, thank you so much for taking time and joining this talk. And and before I actually begin, talking about functions, I want to spend some time on some of the things related to development that we actually launched. Some of them are in pilot, some of them are in like closed dev preview. Functions is the one that we'll focus today. It's on closed dev preview, but I'll show you with a simple example how to create a function, how to locally deploy it, and then one of the areas that I'll skip today is actually deploying these functions to the servers, because on the server currently there are some development things that are happening, and I don't want to sort of use that live server to deploy it. But we'll talk about everything, and locally I'll build the function. The good thing about the functions is we can build locally and test it. So I'll use that for this talk. So there are a couple more things like Code Builder and DevOps Center, which are in pilot. If any of you have been lucky enough, Code Builder is one thing. There's a lot of traction currently, and it's in pilot. You'll have to go through your AEs to actually get access to that. There is a little bit of demo that I'll run, not in this one, but next, when we meet for the Atlanta dev, because I'm still going through the legalities inside Salesforce to find out, okay, what is appropriate to demo, what is not. And DevOps Center is something admin related. So there's a link to all the admin blog and developer blog about this that we'll go through. So first, I'll talk some slides on Code Builder. So Code Builder, again, it's a new thing, right? So the reason why we are sort of building this Code Builder at Salesforce is because we want one unified experience for all the tools. Like today, if you're an admin, right, installing the VS Code on your machine, installing all the extensions, configuring the CLI, it is quite a task, and if you come from an admin background, not from a developer background, right, it takes some time. Similarly for admins, for developers, right, today, right, you have to go through approvals. If your IT is very strict, like I know that some customers, there are IT approvals required for your desktop tools, right? So you have to go through all this path, right? With Code Builder, what we want to make sure is, we'll give you an environment which feels like, Visual Studio Code. It's online, available, with all the extensions installed and everything configured, so that you just focus on writing code. So yeah, I want to skip this slide and just a little bit around the Salesforce developer tools, right? So I don't know if you have been building a lot of LWC components, but if you have been, one of the features that I regularly use is local development. Local development is a feature that basically helps uh, quickly build your LWC component without actually deploying to the Salesforce environment. So you can rapidly prototype something. It's a pretty handy feature. You have to have Visual Studio Code, and there's an extension, not an extension, there's a CLI plugin for it. So you install that, and after that, you can pretty much preview your components right in your local. Basically creates a local host for you where you can debug and has a hot reloading. That is, the moment you make some changes to your code, that gets reflected there. All right. Next slide. So Salesforce CLI, I want to skip this, but just know that the Salesforce CLI will continue to sort of get investments from Salesforce. We want to make sure that it's going to help you creating sandboxes, scratch arcs, keeping your arcs in sync with source control, build LWC, Apex objects, everything from CLI. So it'll continue to be the tool. In fact, the CLI engine will itself be used for code builder also. So it'll continue to get better and better. Extension for VS Code, I'm going to skip this. Replay debugger, I thought it's a good refresher. So if you are using replay debugger, right, and if you have issues with debugger, let us know, or let us know any feedback on Apex Replay Debugger. If you're not using it, then also let me know. So this is one of the features that allows you to debug your Apex locally. I know that even me as a developer, I got used to like just writing system.debug on the server and taking the logs, right? So it took some time for me to get used to locally debugging by using the logs. But once I got used to it, I thought it's really a effective tool, to debug your Apex. All right. So I don't want to spend some time, and I thought I'll spend some time on JavaScript developer certification. So this is one of the things that got announced in Trailer DX, and immediately after that, I went through the same path that our partners go through, our customers go through. So I had to complete a super badge for that, and there are some prerequisites to even become eligible for the Lightning Web Component super badge. So and then you have to complete a multiple choice JavaScript developer 1 exam. Now the exam, I went to the exam and luckily sort of passed. My passing score was like around 75 or something. So luckily just got passed. I think 65 is the passed score. So one of the things I noted in that exam was it's all purely JavaScript. There's no Salesforce element to it. In fact, I took some of the tips here to share if you're preparing. If you're not preparing, that's fine, but know that some of these fundamentals will go a long way in actually making sure that you write better LWC components. So the key takeaway for me was, I had to understand fundamentals like event loop, promises, objects, especially in promises, those arrow syntaxes that really got me confused because I was always used to writing functions and bracket and return statements. But with ES6 syntax, right, it's really tricky, to get used to it. But do get used to it, do a lot of code. I had to go to the Mozilla developer docs, and I myself sort of took every other example that I thought was complex to actually code it and see it and step through. It makes it really easy because the exam is really hard if you do not sort of understand the fundamentals, right? And also pay attention to the object-oriented JavaScript like inheritance, especially the prototypal inheritance, the classes, the new ES6 classes, decorators. So all these things will be asked, So I thought I'll share this, and yeah, super badge, it took me like 18 to 20 hours. I calculated, I took it in a multiple days, like, it took me like 3-4 days. So do plan for it. It's going to definitely take 15 to 20 hours, to complete those super badge. But it's super, helpful once you do it, because you have lots and lots of code samples after that, pretty much for a lot of your requirements. Simple out of the box requirements, you'll see that you'll keep going back to the code base that you have built. um, okay. Okay, so now let's get on to the fun part, right? So Salesforce Functions. So a couple more slides and then we'll straight away jump into demo and code. Okay, so Salesforce Functions, right? So why do we need Salesforce Functions, right? So there are primarily, the primary reason I see we need Salesforce Functions on the platform is because of the CPU limitations that we have. So everyone knows that in a context, right? Today in Salesforce, you have that CPU limit of, I think it's 10 seconds. So in that limit, right, there's only certain number of processes that are possible. Now you might have certain operations which takes, which requires more computing power, like for example, image or file processing, right? Or if you have a query, which takes a lot of time, for example, you have a big database, which you want to query. Today with the SOQL, there is a limit before you start, um, you know, um, there is a specific limit, right? So if you have done sockles and if you have worked with large data volume apps, you would have quickly noticed that you can scale only to certain instance, and after that, the moment you start getting a lot of data in an object, right, you will see that your queries are getting timeout. Those type of issues you will see. So really there are limits and boundaries, right? And we want to make sure that we give you that elasticity, which is to scale by using the event driven computing. Also, there are tasks where you want to do with high volumes, like for example data validation or cleansing, that can happen asynchronously, right? Today you use ETL tools, or you use some kind of third-party tool to do that, right? Um, where you have to securely connect between third-party and Salesforce, establish the connection, figure out the adapters. So all those requires a lot of backend logic, right? So what we want to do is we want to give you some infrastructure, infrastructure that's going to make it very convenient, for you to not have to sort of build it or rebuild it again and again, right? So reusable backend logics, so for that functions qualify. Okay, so one thing to note is here you see we say business apps and logic and consumer apps and services, right? So today, like consumer apps, right? If you have like really worked on an enterprise application, you would have noticed that to build a consumer apps on Salesforce, you would have used communities, or a Heroku front end, or any other technology, right? Those usually the consumer apps where you have large number of users, right? There are all these use cases, which is you need financial calculations, you need resource intensive processes. So for all those things, right, you would have used something outside Salesforce, and when it comes to using something outside Salesforce, there's also one parameter that comes into picture is security, right? How secure it is, and building a secure connections and security is itself a lot of work. And that's where the function sort of comes into the thing, because you no more have to worry about that infrastructure, because Salesforce will provide you that infrastructure with connection. So I'll show you our demo now, or we'll run something and see. Okay. All right, so this is the last slide, and I'll go into the demo after this. So really the idea of the function was, so we built that HTTP serverless function. Now, why is it called like, so first of all, right, like the invocations that you see here. So one of the things that the functions will have is you can invoke from a lot of different components inside Salesforce. They might be declarative, they might be programmatic, right? For example, Apex, right? So you should be able to use Apex class and call that function that you have built. And for for non-programmers or low coders, right, you should be able to use things like flow builders, to do it. And similarly, you should be able to use things like platform events to actually invoke these functions. So the functions that we'll be building, right, will have it's basically like a publisher, right? And once you publish that function, right, the invocation could be from any of these, right? And the other thing to note is, look here, it's language agnostic, right? So today, if you want to build something on Salesforce platform, you need like Apex, right? Now, let's say we have a lot of node libraries out there that can help image processing, that can do machine learning, they can do all sorts of resource intensive processes. And there are tons of libraries like that in Node or Java, right? So Apex should not become the limit here. If a Java programmer wants to build something with Salesforce data, they should be able to do that. And that's why the serverless container runtime that we'll provide will support all these languages, at least 3 of them, right? To begin with, I think to begin with, definitely Node.js, and that's what I'll do in my demo. We'll in fact use Node.js to actually build it, right? So yeah, so that's function basically. So let's see. So now let's get back to coding, and I will show. So one thing I want to say here is, this is also like probably my first or second time going through this product, because it's getting built, and the things that are changing. So there might be some hookups here and there when we actually do this live here, but we'll see. So the aim here is to so what I want to demonstrate is how to basically create a function metadata in Salesforce. So the commands for that. I'll walk through the tools that I have on my machine to do that. And the next thing is how to sort of run those functions locally, and how I can invoke them locally. Now I'll not get into debugging of it, because it's going to take some more time, and we are still figuring out some of the debugging aspect of it. But I'll leave you with something around debugging. Like I'll go through a document which shows if you want to debug in Visual Studio Code locally, you can do that. One thing I'll not cover today is actually deploying this function to the server. That I will not cover. It's just one command that will not cover, and that's because, again, the infrastructure things that we have at our end, it's a work in progress, and there are a lot of things preventing me at this point. So let's get started. Okay. So let me know if you can. So can you see my Visual Studio Code, Jitendra?
Yeah, Amit. Sorry, yeah, Mohit, I can.
Okay. All right. So to start with functions, right, we will need a Salesforce org where the functions is sort of enabled. It will be your dev hub, so this functionality right today, I don't know about the future. Again, safe harbor, I don't know about the future. It might be available in the developer orgs, but today, what is recommended is to have an org where you have dev hub enabled, and that org will have a setting to enable functions. So that's today there are only limited number of orgs with that. I have access to one of them that I'll be using. So let's get started. So first thing is we need a project scaffold. So again, I'll be using SFDX, right? So the prerequisite here is you need SFDX CLI, and the Visual Studio extension pack for Salesforce. Without that, we can't do it, right? There are a few more things we will need. I'll go through them. We need a Docker desktop. I'll show you how to sort of install that Docker desktop. You can, depending on your operating system, you can actually install them. And then you will also need one more plugin. I'll talk about that. That's for Salesforce Functions. Now that plugin is still named as Evergreen. Evergreen used to be a name before TDX. So you need that plugin as well, because that plugin has the commands related to this. So let's get started first by creating a project. So I'll create a project. So again, I want to go step by step, because a lot of you might not be familiar with this CLI. So let's call it as functions demo project. Okay, so now it's going to ask me where do I have to put, so I'll just put it in my project folder. It's creating the scaffold. Okay, so so this will create the scaffold. Everybody is familiar. Most of us are familiar with this, right? Now what we want is so yeah, so we want to create functions, right? So before that, as I said, we have to do one thing, which is to enable or basically authorize the dev hub, right? So we need to authorize the dev hub because that's where we will have to enable the functions, right? So let's see. So SFDX. So let's authorize a dev hub. So authorization of the dev hub, I need the org. Let me get the org. And just give me a sec. I need to grab the, let me grab the correct org here. One sec. Okay, let me do one thing. I also want to do, okay, so what I'm gonna do here is I'm also opening another VS Code instance where I have the org already authorized. So I don't want to, sort of waste time finding that org. There are too many orgs at this point. So there should be one for Salesforce Functions demo, okay. Okay, so what is, so one of the commands that I often use to know is sfdx force config list. It sort of gives me the dev hub that I was authorized previously. Okay, so this is the org. Okay, so I will set this for the new folder that we are creating. I'm just gonna cancel this actually, and I'll set it. Now, again, not to confuse you all, the reason why I'm doing this way is I don't want to go and authorize again, right? Because I've already authorized it. I'm just gonna set that as my default dev hub org. So I can do that by using sfdx force config set, and then what am I setting is default dev hub username equals this guy. Do I have an alias for it? Okay, I don't have an alias. Okay, I will just use this. Okay, so this got set, right? So this is the org, right? So let me see if I can open that org now. sfdx force org open, and the username for that is this. So let me open that special org where, it's a special org because, it has the functions enabled. I want to show you from the setup what it looks like. So from the setup, let me drag this down here. So from the setup, right? I want to pull this guy here. Okay, so from the setup, right, all that you need to type here is dev hub, and that's where we keep all the things. So you see there is something called enable evergreen functions development, right? Okay, it looks like somebody sort of turned this off. But maybe for this special org, we don't need this to be turned on. We'll soon find out if this is required to be turned on. But yeah, so you will see these options, right? And that needs to be actually turned on. I don't know why it is sort of disabled here, but we'll figure it out if somebody did something from the backend. So, okay, so with me so far, right? So what we have done is we have just authorized our project. We've created a project. We have, authorized the dev hub. We have, we need to enable this function thing, right? I am a little hesitant to enable it, but we'll see if in the demo we'll run into issues, right? I'll just enable this. But I know for sure that this requires an enablement for sure, but we'll see. Okay, so now I'm gonna create a scratch arc. So creation of the scratch arc is sfdx create a default scratch arc. I'm gonna just give the, let's call it as functions. Sorry, I should, wait. Did I lose it? Okay. Okay, so that scratch arc, right? So create a default scratch arc. Let's call it as functions demo. Let's say 7 days. Okay, so now it's gonna create a scratch arc. It should, if it doesn't, then we'll see. I'll take, okay, there you go. Okay, the scratch arcs are done. Okay, so the scratch arc is done, right? Okay, one thing I forgot. Okay, one thing I forgot is I created a scratch arc now without the feature. So I'll talk about what that feature is. So if you go to your config, right? So your project scratch definition.json, right? So here we need to enable that feature called functions. This is the feature flag that is required. Now I forgot it. So what I'm gonna do here is do once more, basically. So if you don't, again, note that if you don't have this feature, right, functions, you will not be able to sort of create a function. I think it still allowed me to create locally, but when I actually go and deploy it to my scratch arc, it'll not let me do that. Okay, so command palette, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna basically create another scratch arc. Create a default scratch arc. Select this functions demo. Let's call it 2. Okay, so I basically wasted a scratch arc. Hopefully, I don't hit the limit today of the number of scratch arcs. There it is. I think it did create it because I can see here it says function demo 2. Okay. All right. So now that we have the arc, right, we should be all set to actually create a function. So let me close this pop out here. Just a check, Jitendra, are you able to hear and see my screen, right?
Yes, Mohit, I can.
Okay. Is there anything else required, like raising the font or anything like that? Just let me know.
Sure. So, team, if anyone wants to make any change right on the UI or the font, please post a question in the chat. But from my side, Mohit, all looks good. You can keep that pace.
Perfect. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open the scratch arc. Now there's no point sort of opening it now, right? But let's open that just to make sure that the arc is there. So force arc open should open it. So by default, it'll open my default scratch arc. That's how. Notice that in my previous command, I had to actually go and say that open up the dev hub arc, right? But once it is sort of authorized, which shows up here, you don't need to actually specify that. And you can also open by just clicking on this in case you don't know. Like for example, when I click this, it runs that same command that I just sort of ran. So this is my scratch arc, it's there. And it did allowed me to go by functions. Now, one thing I have to internally figure out is why did they switch this thing off, right? Okay, I think it's on, this is for disabling it. I think it's sort of enabled, I guess, yeah, so everything looks good so far. So now is the time we'll create functions. So before creating the function, one thing I want to show you is, if you can see my command line here, one of the things I want to show you is you have to install this plugin. So when I do SFDX plugins in my machine, see this Evergreen 0.22.11, which is with the build 0.12.4, right? So you need this plugin. And the way you can get that plugin is by doing sfdx plugins install and then put the plugin name. The plugin name is Evergreen. Now this is where I was telling that this might all change, by the time it goes to GA. It might be called Salesforce Functions or anything. I'm not sure, what it will be, but you can install the plugins by, by doing this. And that's what I did. And that's why I have the plugin. So I have all the Salesforce CLI plugins, right? And then I have an extension plugin, which is Evergreen, which provides Evergreen functionalities. Now, you can do a help on all of these, right? So that is one of the features, right? So you can do force Evergreen, right? And do a help that will tell you all the commands that this Evergreen, wait, did it tell? Did I, okay, so let's do this. So tx force, let's do the force app first. Maybe I don't need the force key. Okay, maybe I just, let's try. So maybe I just need to save for Evergreen, I guess. Yeah, so that was my bad, right? So this is what happens. So force command you don't need. Force command is for the force. I think they completely renamed that to, or they completely got rid of the force, right? And for Evergreen, it's Evergreen. Again, this might change. This all might change, but look at some of the things, right? It gives. So for example, auth, Evergreen auth is to manage authentication. So this is an authentication to Evergreen space. So the way this will work is you have your Salesforce environment, right? Now, if you're building a function, you will get an environment which basically you can authorize by using Evergreen auth. That's kind of a space, right, where your actual service will be deployed once you kind of build these Evergreen functions, right? So yeah, so that server, right, Evergreen auth server is only needed after you sort of create your functions, right? So you create your functions and then you link that function to the Scratch org. I will show you how we can do that. And then once you want to deploy, you auth. Now, one of the things to remember is, okay, what is the credential to authorize that Evergreen space that you get, right? Or the Salesforce function space. So to do that, right, you will need either the Heroku credentials of, if you're like, a customer who doesn't have Salesforce environment and you have Heroku, right? And you still want to use Evergreen, you can do that. Actually, Evergreen can be used outside Salesforce. So you need your Heroku credentials. Or if you have a Salesforce environment, right, you can use the Salesforce environment credentials to actually log in. It's just that it has to be enabled with your DevHub. So you will use your DevHub, not your Scratch or credentials. You'll use your DevHub to sort of authorize it, right? So in this case, I'll show you. I'll show you the interface. It's basically nothing. It's one screen where you just go and put your credentials and authorize it, right? We'll come to that. Just shortly. So now what I want to do is I want to create a function, Evergreen. So to create a function, that is where we have this Evergreen function command, which is basically sftx Evergreen and then function. So, and then you can do a help to see what all you can do on the functions. So see, you can create a function, you can delete it, you can deploy it, you can invoke that function locally, right, by sending an event. You can list all the functions that are there in your space. You can release a function. You can update a function. Again, these are all commands. Again, it's a closed pilot today, right? So I think they're all working on it. And once we have like proper set of commands, right, it'll be only till we get into beta. But I want to show you that these are the commands. So let's actually create a function, right? Okay, so now I'm in this project that I was working on. So let's create a function. Now to create a function, right, the command that we will use is this. I have a simple cheat sheet for myself because I don't want to be embarrassed typing all the wrong commands here. Also, as I said, it's like my first time doing a lot of these. Okay, so now, so we can use TypeScript. So the language today, it allows you to two things, TypeScript and JavaScript. Okay, so I initially wanted to do the TypeScript, and last night I was trying with something around TypeScript. I realized that they will have to update it to the newest version of the TypeScript to resolve some of the compile time bundling issues, right? So it's still something that they're working on, right? So I don't want to use that and blow up my demo, right? So I'll stick with, instead of TypeScript, I'll stick with JavaScript for now. So let's use JavaScript, but you should be able to use TypeScript, in the product. Once this product sort of comes to life, right, we should be able to use this. Now, one thing you saw is here it's saying my function, right? So this my function should be the function name. So look at the command, it's pretty easy. So you need to do this sfdx evergreen functions in it, right? Now you can alias this with with bash if you like, or with your shell, right? But I like to type the whole command. So it's initialize the function, right, with the function name. So my function name, let's call it as demo function, or let's just keep it as it is. I'm going to call my function itself. That's fine. Let's call it my function, right? And this name you need it when you are sort of invoking this function, so or deploying it, so it's okay, right? So, and then the language is JavaScript, and then M is where do you want this thing to be created? Now the metadata to be created, right? So I said, okay, create it inside my Force app main default, right? So I say enter. Okay, so you saw something got here. So one of the things that got created was the function bundle. So the function bundle, right? It's a metadata. Again, the functions will also be metadata driven, and it will be packageable once it is available, right? It will be used by ISVs as well, so they can bundle this along with any other components that they today bundle. So you will be able to bundle the functions. So that's why we give you a metadata, so that it's part of the Salesforce, right? It's part of your Salesforce application, just like any other metadata. So, but one thing you would notice is there is also functions created here, right? Let me see. Okay, so there is also functions directory that got created, and inside that there is my function, which was my function name, and there is a read me, right? There's a little read me basically for you to sort of document your functions. And then there is package.json, right? So because this is a Node JavaScript project, right, we want to give all the dependencies that it will be used by this function, right? Now you will be able to add your own dependencies as well. But notice one thing here is we give you automatically this Salesforce SDK, which has three things. I'll talk about that. So if you open the index.js file, which will be the first function, or let's say it will be the whatever you place here, right, will be the method that will be invoked. Or I come from Apex background, so I always keep telling method, but it's actually the function, right? So this is the first function that will be invoked when you actually invoke these functions that will so it will have three things, right? So it will have event, which will be the data that you can send to this. It will have the context. Now the context is where it's like a session, right? So you can do query, you can do DML, right? So let's see if the intelligence work here. So I can show you something. So if I do context, right, and say context dot, so look at some of the things that we give you, right? So arg dot, right? So it will give you, so for example, I want to do query, it will give you query. If I want to, do something from the SDK, right? It'll give me something from the SDK. I think you get the point, right? So the arg dot data will have everything. Like um, it'll have ability to insert data into Salesforce, right, from this function, or take the data. So for example, in this context, right, all that I'm doing is I'm saying context.org.data.query, where I'm just querying all the accounts in my Scratch org, right? So I'm querying all the accounts in my current Scratch org, and then what I'm doing here is I'm just logging them and returning them. I'm not doing anything. So let's keep it as it is, but this is where you will actually be able to sort of import more modules, like node modules using require, right? If you have a TypeScript, you'll use import statements to import those modules. But once you have those modules, what you will do is, you will write your logic, right? Now, this could be like many number of rows, there's no limit for it, right? As long as your functions, right? Evergreen functions has enough space and enough RAM allocated, right? You can do whatever with this data and directly insert in Salesforce. Now, notice other thing is I didn't have to sort of, think about my authentication, etc. It's all done by this context. The context has the session, it has the auth, it'll have the session. So you have the Salesforce session directly in your function so that you can interact with Salesforce. Okay, so so now that we have created this function, right? It basically does very simple thing. It just prints this message and then it's like calling. Okay, so now you have this function. Let's actually do. So one thing you have to remember, right? It's not Salesforce project, right? We need to install all the dependencies. Like package.json only gave us the references, but we need all the dependencies to be installed. So to do that, right, what I'll have to do is I'll have to cd into the functions. So I'll cd into the functions. So I cd into the functions, and I'll maybe I'll also need to cd into the my function, I guess. Okay, so I'll cd into my function. Okay, and then npm install, because now what we want to do, and this again, this will depend on the language, right? Let's say in the future they come up with providing a Maven's file for Java, right? You basically get all the dependencies right in your local. So let's do an npm install here. So npm install will basically bring all the node modules, right? So it has got all the node modules for me. Okay, so it has all the dependencies and node modules now. Now what we want to do is so we have everything intact, right? So now we want to run this function locally, right? Okay, so to do that, so I have to start the function, right? Now what will happen is if I just start it like this, right? It's not gonna start because see, it requires a container, right? It requires a container, like a local server, right, where it can deploy all the dependencies. It has the necessary, um, necessary node module. For example, this requires an engine about 10.00, right? So to help you with that, we need the Docker, right? So installation of, again, Docker, you don't need to know like any of the Docker CLI commands in general, but you need to just understand that this requires a Docker for local testing. So what I did is I just went to Docker desktop for Mac. So I used Docker desktop for Mac and I just downloaded from the Docker Hub. So this will be required. The Docker will be required for local testing. If you're deploying on the server, you don't need it, but usually when you're actually building it, you have to build it and test it against your local server, right? With the dependencies, etc. So basically they're creating an image inside this Docker. So there's a Docker image that gets created when this command that I shown you, this evergreen function start command, right? So when we do this evergreen function start command, right, that is where it has to start on the Docker. So let's start the Docker. I might have downloaded it. I don't see it here. Let's see. Docker.app, right? So just go to docker.app. So it's starting the Docker now here. Okay, yeah, it is started. So it is running now. The Docker is running. So yeah, we don't need to make any configuration changes, honestly. If you're building some kind of a CPU intensive process, then I think you might have to adjust your memories here and there. But just for the simple, I don't need to do anything. Okay, so now the next thing that we want to do is, so we have this thing, right? We invoking this. So let's create that Docker image, or start the function. So to start the function, I have to put this command. Am I in the right project? I do. Okay. All right. So now we start the function. So we say sfdx evergreen at functions dot start. So this is gonna, so see what it's doing. It is creating a container, right? And then it's gonna start the container. It's gonna take some time. Basically, we should see. So you see, it's gonna install the build pack, which is the Node.js build pack. It's gonna install all the tools, like for example, JQ will be available, so it's installing, and then it's gonna take the package.json, install all those dependencies that we have configured here. So it's gonna create an image with everything. Um, so it says it started listening at, what's that? So it is listening at this port. So it's ready to process signals. Okay, so now, right, so now what we can do here is we can invoke this function. Now this function is like sort of locally available, right? And when you actually deploy this function, right, that is when it will be sort of available for, like, without local, right? And it will give you an URL, and you will see that this bundle file here will get updated with that URL, right? Now that part of the thing I cannot cover, right? But I'll show you how to invoke this locally. So let's invoke this locally, actually. So let's invoke from the command line. So to invoke this, I'm just gonna use this thing. I'm just gonna copy paste here, actually. Again, I don't need to pass any payload, honestly, because we are not doing anything with the payload, right? But you can send information, and that will be available here in the event context. If you say event.data, right, and then you can use that to do your processing. So let's actually invoke it. Let's see if the invocation actually works. So I need the arg alias, right? Because it needs to know which arg this is. And I think our arg alias, which is our arg alias here. So it's function demo 2, right? Functions demo 2. Okay. So our arg alias is functions demo 2. Okay. So now this should run that logic that is there, which is basically returning nothing. That's sad that it run nothing, but it's because my scratch arg has nothing, right? So let's create some data inside that scratch arg. Okay, our scratch arg is inspiration ability. That's nice. That's a lot of inspiration today. Okay, so now let's create some data to showcase that it's actually able to query the data from Salesforce accounts. So new, I'm gonna say Rita user group. Right. Are we querying only the name and the ID? That's it? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna just, and I'm gonna also say Atlanta developer group. Okay, that's fine. Two of them is fine. So now when I actually invoke this time, we should see 2 rows, right? There it is, the 2 rows that we just created. So this is how you sort of locally create it, right? Now, as I said, locally is fine, right? But it has to actually get deployed to that space. We call it as, workspace or evergreen space. But unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to demo that. So you see the logs that we printed, it started printing in the terminal, right? The host name and the PID, the request ID and the payload, because I said, invoking function with us, right? So let's actually do this one more thing, which is I want to show you the Evergreen login interface, that how it looks. So basically I run this and this should take me to a nice little login screen of Evergreen. So again, it's all developer preview, right? But when you say actually log in, um, so now it will ask me for the credential, and I'll put my DevHub credential and it'll say I'm authenticated, right? So once I do that, my CLI has the context that, okay, this is the space this needs to actually work with. And from there, I just need to execute that functions deploy command. And once it does, it will basically, give you a URL, a proper URL here, and HTTP post URL, secured HTTP post URL, that has all the SSL handled automatically for you, and that knows that this is this specific Salesforce org context. So once you do that, right, both the platforms, right, will be talking. In fact, it's the same thing, but that the container, right, where this gets deployed, right, will have more power. That means you should be able to sort of build your architecture in a microservice pattern, where you can offload some of the heavy resource intensive process off to that endpoint, and that should take care of things. Like, think about all of the patterns, right? Like asynchronous patterns or integration patterns, where it is like fire and forget, right? So those type of patterns will be very easily be possible with this functions, once it gives you the capability. Now you can also scale. It has inbuilt scalability, so depending on your needs, it will scale and it will complete the job, and it can reach out into Salesforce to do some things. Like, for example, let's say you have 1 million rows and you want to count the number of records, right? It can basically, you can invoke that function. The function can query all the data. It can do that roll up count. It can come to the Salesforce and on a field stamp the record, very easily with few lines of code, without you having to worry about, okay, what will be the integration, etc., right? And then basically, just like anything, you will be able to deploy these functions to the higher environments. Okay, so I think with this, I pretty much covered what I intended to, right? And I'll open up for some questions. So before that, right, some things, you can actually go to this URL and sign up to get updates on some functionalities that we'll be building, right? So this is like a newsletter basically. So it will give you update on how things are happening inside Salesforce for these functions, right? Like, what are the new functionalities that we enabled, when are the docs coming, etc., right? So and how are pilot customers doing, etc. So you'll get that. So sign up for the updates here,